In our last lecture, we did some exploring of different kinds of creation myths. We looked at a Navajo emergence myth, and we looked at a Maori separation of world parents myth. This time we're going to continue that kind of exploration by looking at one cosmic egg creation myth. This one we'll illustrate with the Chinese myth of Pan Ku. And then we'll take another brief look at an ex nihilo. We've already had an example of this in the first Genesis creation story, but this time we'll look more closely at the Mayan creation story from the Popol Vuh and see what they have to tell us. In a cosmic egg kind of creation story, chaos is always seen as the inside of an egg. Breaking or cracking is what initiates creation. It's a similar pattern to what we've had in other kinds of stories, in that what was once mixed up and undifferentiated gets to be separated and divided. And it's been suggested that the cosmic egg may be the most widely distributed kind of creation myth in the world. There are a lot of similarities in all of the cosmic egg story, but there are a lot of variations too, interesting variations, cultural deflections we've been calling them. The Dogon in Mali in Africa have a creator god who breaks a cosmic egg with vibrations, and then he releases twin divinities, the divinity of order and the divinity of chaos, and they continue on with what's going to happen next. In Tahiti, there's a god named Ta'aroa who lives in an egg-like shell which just turns endlessly in space until he breaks the shell. And then he uses the shell to make the world. Part of it he makes into the sky, part of it he uses to make rocks and sand, and then he takes apart his own body to make mountains and clouds and soil and trees and sea creatures. His head he keeps to himself, he doesn't make anything out of that, and his body marvelously isn't destroyed by using it to make the world. These people, in fact, see the entire universe itself as a series of shells. The sky is the shell it contains the sun and the moon and the stars. The earth is the shell that contains stones and water and plants. And the human body itself is seen as a shell. It's always a feminine shell, since it's through a woman that both men and women come into the world. There's a Japanese version of a cosmic egg myth in which in the beginning nothing was separated and all inside the egg was a chaotic mass. And then the separation, when it happens along the lines of yin and yang. The pure, clearer parts of the egg become the sky, and the heavier and grosser parts sink down to become the earth. The Mandi in Africa have a god Mangala who makes an egg in twin parts, and then he requires that the two parts procreate with each other. And that egg and the procreation, plus a few seeds, contain everything out of which the entire cosmos, nature, and humans are made. And the Finnish Kalevala has an androgynous bird that lays an egg on the upraised knee of the Mother of Waters. When that egg opens, part of it makes the sky, the yolk becomes the sun, the white part becomes the moon, the mottled part becomes the sky, the stars, and the black part becomes the clouds. In Lecture 3, we were close to a cosmic egg myth already when we had those gods and goddesses who emerged partly as frogs, partly as serpents from the slime of the Nile, who then produced a cosmic egg, not a comic egg, which was fertilized by Ammon, and from which the sun is then hatched. In other Egyptian myths, the egg is actually laid by Ammon, who lays it as an androgynous goose. In the Chandogya Upanishad in India, non-being becomes an egg, and when it splits, the silver part becomes the earth, the gold part becomes the sky, the outer membrane becomes the mountains, the inner membrane clouds and mists, the veins become the rivers, and the fluid parts become the ocean. The Brahmanas from India have a creator Prajapati who is hatched from a golden egg after an incubation of 1 year, which the text tells us is about the same gestation period as a cow or a mare or a woman. That is, we could go on like this. There are a lot of cosmic egg myths. This time, however, we want to take a closer look at one of them, that is, that the Chinese myth of Pan Ku. A cosmogonic myth A cosmogonic myth in China is a very rare kind of event. Much of the material that went into myths in other countries went into abstract philosophical speculation about the origins of the cosmos in China. So there are more treatises than there are stories in Chinese creation accounts. This one comes from fairly late in Chinese cultural history, dates from about the 3rd century. And the original work in which it appears has been lost. It survives only in fragments and quotations in later works. Anne Birrell, in her Chinese mythology, says that she notices that in this story, primeval chaos is described not as an egg, but like an egg, clearly a simile, so that she suggests there may be some literary manipulation going on here, and this may suggest a very late provenance for this myth. Some people even thought the myth was just made up by some 3rd century author who nevertheless drew on older material, since Pan Ku is at least referred to in earlier works. Since, however, it is so unique in Chinese history, we'll have to use it. But if you come across your reading of this in any of the texts that you run across, be prepared for some introductory caveats and perhaps for an occasional variant. In this myth, the insides of everything are mingled like an egg. Pan Ku is engendered inside that egg, where he grows for 18,000 years. He stretches out and bursts the egg, or the egg breaks of its own, and the parts that are light form the heavens, and the parts that are dark form the earth. Barbara Sproul, in her Primal Myth, says that behind this lies a very ancient Chinese conception of yin and yang. The words seem to have originally meant just light and dark, or they may have even been more specifically referred to the dark and light side of a riverbank. But they became a really fundamental conception in Chinese thought, in which yang came to mean brightness and activity and strength and hardness and masculinity, while yin became darkness and passivity and tranquility and femininity. Ultimately, yang became associated with heaven, yin became associated with earth. They are polar opposites, but they are mutually exclusive, mutually interdependent. That is, they cannot exist without the other. One does not mean anything without the other, and they depend on each other for their very existence. We can see how that lies behind this story of Pan Ku, in that the way the egg divides into low and high, into light and dark, into earth and heaven. Once he's released, Pan Ku works to keep the elements separate, sky and earth separate, by bracing his feet against the earth and his shoulders against the heaven. And this, if you think he's doing this with parts that were an egg, this can't be easy. They're slippery, indistinct masses, so he is working very hard to keep them pushed apart. This work of pushing apart the earth and the sky goes on by Pan Ku for another 18,000 years, during which time Pan Ku is growing 10 feet per day, which means that as he keeps pushing, the sky keeps getting 10 feet farther away from the earth every day. And while he's doing this, he's also piling up the earth to make mountains, digging out the valleys. He's making channels for the rivers to flow in. At the end of this 18,000 years, he is totally exhausted. He lies down and he immediately dies. What happens next really belongs in our next lecture, but we need to finish this story. When Pan Ku dies, all of the elements of his body are transformed into stuff needed to finish off creation. His breath becomes the wind and clouds, his voice becomes the thunder, his eyes become the sun and moon, his limbs and fingers become the 4 cardinal directions and the 5 great mountains of the world. His blood becomes the rivers, his flesh becomes soil, his hair and beard become constellations, his skin and body become hair, and his skin and body hair become plants and trees, his teeth and bones become metals and stones. Even the marrow in his bones becomes gold and precious stones. His sweat becomes the rain. A charming little detail of this story is that the parasites that live on his body are impregnated by the wind, and they become human beings. So, as in the story of Marduk and Tiamat, the world here is created out of the body of a divine creature so that we can continue to live on his body. Our dependence on him is captured in the idea that we're descendants of parasites. We are still parasites in some sense, living on his body and dependent on him for survival. That second part of the story, the creation of the universe out of a dismembered body, we'll actually take up and do in more detail in the next lecture. This time we want to go back and just look at the cosmic egg part of it and ask, how do we read a cosmic egg story? It has the same kind of patterns that other myths do. There is an initial chaos which leads to differentiation, to the dualism of sky and earth, male and female. For the Chinese, also yin and yang. As Barbara Sproul says about this kind of myth in China, creation proceeds by the development of increasingly distinct forms out of this original chaos. First, something evolves from nothing. Within something, the fundamental creative powers, male and female, are delineated, and finally the creator god, Pan Ku, is born, child of chaos. The Chinese word for chaos, by the way, is Hun Tun, and we have actually run across that word before in Lecture 4 in von Franz's story of the unconscious, whose friends drilled holes in him to try to give him access to the world and killed him in the process. The same word, by the way, and this is also interesting, I think, is used in Chinese cuisine as the name of a sack-like dumpling, which is filled with mixed chopped stuff, which is appropriate since the Hun Tun in von Franz's story is pictured as a kind of sack without any sensory organs at all. The division of this chaos, this Hun Tun, into separateness and binary opposition is crucial, since without it, again, as in all creation stories, we have only stasis, entropy, eternal sameness. Creation is always posited on the friction of opposition. David McYagan, in his book Creation Myths, says that in a Hindu myth, Brahma begins by starting to try to create things, and he makes a series of mistakes. He winds up inadvertently creating ignorance and creating night, which he then tries to destroy. But he cannot destroy them. They are created, they survive, and they give rise to creatures of ignorance and darkness against which creation will forever be measured. That's what creation is. McYagan also quotes Jakob Boehme, an early 17th century German Christian philosopher, who says this about the need for opposition in creation. The one, as the yes, is power and life and is the truth of God or God himself. He would in himself be unknowable, and in him would be no joy of elevation nor feeling without the no. That is, duality, opposition, is the nature of creation and of reality. The egg, of course, makes a really wonderful symbol of all of this, because the egg is a symbol of fertility in a way that we still use it at Easter time. We still use it in that same kind of way. It's a source of life. It's also an incubator, so it's a good symbol for the kind of womb. And hence, again, it's a very powerful female symbol. But in some ways, the egg that's talked about in Cosmic Egg Story also is androgynous, or it contains both parts of a duality which then have to be split apart. Perhaps in early stages of religion and myth, the female may have been paramount, but at some stage along the way, we come to the idea of world parents who need to be separated, and we looked at that kind of story in our last lecture. The egg suggests some of these values. The need to separate genders, to separate yin and yang, to separate earth parents, to celebrate light and dark. There are lots of other myths like this in other parts of the world. In some African myths, there are twins who emerge from the egg, male and female, who are both complementary and antagonistic. The Dogon of Mali believe that every infant, when born, possesses both a male and a female soul, and the birth rites and the rites performed over an infant child are designed to get rid of the one soul to give the other one full play. There's some really interesting possibilities in the myths of the cosmic egg. The second kind of myth that we'd like to take a brief look at today is one that we've already looked at in past lectures, and that is ex nihilo. We looked at that already in the first Genesis account. Ex nihilo means literally from nothing, but as we've said, usually it involves something pre-existing with God. As Genesis puts it, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, which means there was something already there. Usually God in ex nihilo stories creates by thinking or speaking or dreaming things into existence, but as we've said, it can also involve bodily excretions, as in the Egyptian myth that we looked back at back in Lecture 3, where the Egyptian god either masturbates or expectorates the first divinities into existence. As we mentioned last time, we tend to think of the Genesis account as unique, but it isn't. There are many other ex nihilo accounts. In a Zuni myth, Awana Willona, the creator god, exists by himself. But then he conceives within himself. He is soul, he is entirely autonomous, he is dependent on no one, but then he conceives inside himself. And as Barbara Sproul puts it in her explication of this myth, the creator god in effect divided himself into chaos and order, not being and being. He conceived a thought within himself and thereby gave birth first to the mists of increase and streams potent of growth, to creative potentiality, the primordial waters, chaos, and secondly to himself as the sun, creative reality, fire, order. So that here you have a God who exists from eternity entirely by himself, and what he does is he conceives from within himself by thinks all these things into existence and sets the process in order. An alternative Maori myth to the one that we looked at last time about Rangi and Papa has a creator named Io who begins by speaking words that divide the light and the darkness, and that's the way creation begins. And there's a really sophisticated version of this in one of the ancient Indian Rig Vedas, which says that the cosmos, it speculates, the cosmos couldn't have come either from being or not being, since their opposition and mutual dependence on each other, like yin and yang, presupposes that they have already been separated from some initial oneness which pre-exists both of them. Now, there has to be something prior to both of them, but the poem goes on to say, we have no language to describe what that thing was. The most one can say is whatever it was one, it breathed windless, but it too was generated by the power of heat. As it evolved, it became desire, the first seed of the mind, and beyond that, we have no language to describe what we're talking about here, how this process works. The poem ends with a series of really interesting questions. They said, who can describe how this first emanation arose? And the answer is the only one who could describe how an emanation began would be God. But since God himself, given this argument that's gone ahead, has to be the first creation, he may be self-evolved, but yes, he still is a first creation. So maybe he doesn't even know. Still, this is an ex nihilo process, a very complicated one here. And so this is just a reminder that there are all kinds of other versions other than that of Genesis, which we looked at a couple of lectures ago. We want to look this time at a creation account, which we've already done some little work with in the very first lecture in this series, from the Mayan epic poem, the Popol Vuh. The Maya at one time occupied the eastern third of Mesoamerica in what's now Guatemala and the Yucatan Peninsula. Their sacred book was the Popol Vuh, which was destroyed by the Spaniards at the time of the conquest, but then later was reconstructed in the original language, but using a Latin alphabet this time, about 100 years after the original had been destroyed. That book has been lost too, but there was a copy that was made by a Spanish missionary, and that one has survived. It is the basis for everything we know about the Popol Vuh to this day. The Popol Vuh is a huge, vast, sweeping epic that contains a lot more than the creation account, but we're only interested in that creation part of it as we talk about it today. That creation account in the Popol Vuh is mostly ex nihilo, but it has some elements of other kinds of creation stories in it as well. When the gods come to make human beings, they seem to make them with their hands out of various materials. There is also a flood story in the Popol Vuh, and as we've already mentioned, there's an account of how the gods started out by making humans a little bit too good and then having to unmake them a bit, to set them back, to increase the distance between gods and humans, maybe a little bit like the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis. This creation begins with a vast expanse of sea and sky, in the midst of which there is a conversation between two gods, Gukumatz, who's called also the plumed serpent, and Hurakan, who is called the heart of heaven. As they discuss their plans, it becomes clear that what they really want to do is they want to create, they don't call them that yet because they're not sure exactly what they're aiming for, but we can see that what they're aiming for are human beings. They want to make something like human beings because those humans will be able to praise the gods and will be able to provide food for them in the form of praise and sacrifice. So they begin by making the earth, and they make the earth in the classic ex nihilo way, simply by willing it into existence. They talk about it, they decide what they want to make, and then they speak the words, and it's made. From the moment that the earth appears, it begins to be covered with vegetation. Again, this is simply the will of the gods, and trees and rivers and mountains and all manner of things until the earth is completely full. And then the gods go ahead and create what they think are going to be their ultimate creatures. They wind up starting with animals. They make all manner of animals and put them in all kinds of various different places in this new planet. It turns out, however, that those animals won't quite do. They can make noises, but they can't talk, and it seems clear to the gods after they've looked at them. They said, this isn't what we had in mind. These creatures are simply not going to be able to give us sacrifice and praise, and so we need to keep working on something else. So they decide their work isn't done, and they send these animals out to the wild wilderness and out to the forest, where they will become food for the next try at making what will become human beings. They try again, and this time they make humans out of mud, and these creatures can talk, but their words make no sense, and they seem to be too fragile really to survive very well. The text doesn't actually say this, but I always imagine creatures made out of mud would dissolve when they got put in contact with water. I'm just making that part up, so that's not actually in the text. So at any rate, these mud people don't work out, and so they destroy them, and then they try for a third time. This time they make humans out of wood. These creatures can talk and they can multiply, but they're dry and bloodless and without expression. They also seem to lack soul and understanding altogether, and they soon forget about their creator. So much for having these creatures be the ones who are going to provide sacrifices for the gods. By the time the gods decide that this creation is a failure too, the wooden people have multiplied, so there are a lot of them around. So destroying them is not going to be as easy as destroying the second creation was. So to destroy them, the gods send a huge flood, and they also turn loose demons across the earth to attack these wooden people. And I think I mentioned this in the first lecture. In the climactic battle, even the animals and the utensils and the furniture and all the artifacts surrounding these wooden people rise up against them. The few who survive become forest monkeys. And this is a nice touch, because every time any Mayan saw a forest monkey, he would be reminded of the failure of that creation. The fourth effort, as we mentioned, is in Lecture 1, involves making humans out of yellow and white maize. 4 men are created in this process, and those 4 immediately begin to praise the gods, and they promise to offer sacrifices, and they promise to be exactly what the gods wanted when they started this creation process in the first place. That's when the gods look at them and say, you know, we perhaps overdid it just slightly this time. These new humans are too much like us. And specifically, the detail it's given is they can see to infinity in the same way that gods can see to infinity. And the gods realize this is not exactly what they have in mind either. They want more distance between themselves and these newly created humans. So, and it's a beautiful image. They say the way when you breathe on a mirror, you fog it up. That's what they do to the vision of these new creatures, so that they will only be able to see things nearby and close up. They will not be able to see into the distance anymore, and that provides enough distance between the gods and humans to make them happy. The gods, however, have a compensation for taking away this gift of vision. The 4 initial creatures created were males in this story, and so what they do is they create 4 beautiful women and give them to the 4 men as wives, and the 4 men are so happy that they don't even particularly notice that their vision has been clouded like breathing vapor on a mirror. And history begins for the Mayans at that particular point. Charles Long, in a book called Alpha, which we've referred to several times during the course of these lectures, sees this kind of myth, this ex nihilo myth, as coming relatively late in history. Most people seem to have had sky gods early on, and those sky gods seem to have been, in many cases, creator gods. But as we've seen, it happens in so many stories that those gods, either after they've created the cosmos, they go away to the sky. They disappear, they become remote, they move out and turn the running of this place over to assistance. Or in some cases, they even turn over the finishing up of creation to assistance. They say, okay, I've gotten it started, now you take it from here. Or if they do continue in close contact with Mother Earth, we've seen various stories in which they are forced to leave. They are pushed apart from Mother Earth and pushed into remoteness from daily life. As we've also noted, Mother Earth always keeps her importance in these stories, usually taking on a new consort to assure that her fertility will be continuous. And that's a pattern that's reinforced as people settle down into agrarian communities where the fertility of domestic animals and crops becomes absolutely crucial to an entire community's survival. The sky gods, however, don't just go away, even if they move out and turn part of their job over to other gods. Usually they retain some of their status and importance. In our next unit, we'll talk more specifically about how these sky gods make their comeback, and they will make their comeback in a big way in such thunderbolt-wielding deities as Zeus or Thor or Indra or Baal. For now, we can simply notice that in ex nihilo stories, the sky gods do make a comeback. They are back, and that's why Wong thinks these are relatively late stories. They reabsorb some of the functions and authority that they earlier gave away when they moved out, and they show new power now in being able to create by thought or word or dream. These are very, very powerful sky gods, seemingly much more powerful than the ones who moved away many centuries ago. As we remember from Lecture 5, in ex nihilo myths, we always deal, in fact, with very powerful God who exists alone in a void and is unhindered by any kind of obstacle or by the will of other gods. His method is usually deliberate and calculated and thought out very much in advance. Most of the other creation stories we've looked at so far have either an element of trial and error in them, in which gods try things out and then see if they work, and then it doesn't work and you have to try something else. Or the other homology that is really powerful and important in creation stories is that of birth. There's a period of conception and gestation and then giving birth, which is a natural process, which is a process which in some ways lacks the kind of deliberation that ex nihilo stories do. Ex nihilo stories aren't simply the carrying out of natural processes, nor are they trial and error. These are always, in some ways, gods who know what they're doing, who think it out very carefully in advance, and then once they have it all dreamed up, once they know what they're going to do, then they put their plan into action. So the deliberation is really important in this kind of story, as is the seemingly unlimited power of these gods who make these things in the first place. This one, if we look at the Mayan myth that we've just been talking about, this is almost but not quite a classical ex nihilo myth. The creators do work with words here until they get to humans, and from there on out they seem to work with their hands, as many other gods have done in many other myths. And from here on, their method does seem to be one of trial and error, since it takes 4 tries to get humans right, and even then they kind of overdo it. They make them a little bit too good and have to scale them back a little bit. So this looks like a lot less deliberation than we're used to in ex nihilo stories. We also said back in Lecture 1 that this story suggests that humans, for the Maya, were the crown of creation. And yes, that's true. But we also have to remember this story makes perfectly clear that humans are created for specific services for the gods. And the gods keep fine-tuning until they get exactly what they want. They want humans to be just so, and even if they have to tune them back a bit to get exactly what they want. So there may be a slight suggestion in this story that we've had in the Enuma Elish and in the second Genesis creation story that humans are made in some ways for service to the gods. It's an interesting detail in this myth. Next time we will conclude our sort of Cook's tour of creation myths by looking at 2 more types, our last 2 types. We'll look at an earth diver myth in which some animal is sent to the bottom of the primeval deep to bring up a bit of mud to start the whole creation process. And then we'll come back and revisit in more detail the creation myth of the dismembered body of a god. The latter we've already had some experience with in the myth of Tiamat and Pan-Ku, but we'll take another look at another myth and then maybe spend a little bit of time pulling that one apart to unpacking it to see what it says. That's next time.